So, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Andy Palmer from Exagrid Systems. I'm the Vice President of International Business for Exagrid, and my colleague Graham Woods is here with me today, and between us we're going to do the presentation for the next 45 minutes or so. Now, firstly, can I ask a couple of questions? Is my English okay? Because I can assure you that my English is better. Your English is probably better than my Estonian. But as long as, please, I hope you can all understand, and I'll try and keep it relatively slow so you can actually catch up, but please stop me if you think I'm going too fast at any stage. Can I ask another question, which is, how many of you were at the Atea event here back in April time? So a couple of you heard some of this presentation stuff before, but maybe that'll be a good reinforcement, but for those of you who haven't heard, I hope you find it interesting. Most important thing, and I'm sure will get your attention, is that if you haven't got one of these, there's a chance to win this lovely mini Bose sound system which works with a mobile phone. All it takes for you to do is complete the little form which tells us a little bit about your infrastructure and whatever else. But if you don't want to do it now, our stand's just outside, not very far away, and from there you can do it as well. So happy to do that. But one per person, please. So, the presentation's described as straight talk. And what we wanted to cover here was talk a little bit about Exagrid and talk a little bit about the issues that face people in backup. Can I ask you another question? How many of you are actually involved directly in backup in your companies? Lots of hands going up, that's good. How many of you are fed up with tape? Well, there's a few hands going up. How many of you actually got rid of tape? Yeah, a few of you, okay. Right, well what we're going to try and do is Exagrid's a company that's involved in the space called disk-based backup with deduplication. And first part of this presentation is to talk a little bit about the issues. So, if this works. So, what should seem such a simple thing and straightforward is often more complex and risky than you think. One of the sad things about backup is it's not very sexy, it's not very interesting, okay? We find so many people sort of, in companies, well, they'd like to fix it, but they really can't get around to fixing backup. And we liken it in the UK to the fact that people tend to put in their burglar alarms after they've been burgled, as opposed to doing it beforehand. So backup's a bit like that, and it's one of those tasks where, it looks pretty easy on the surface of it, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. This is a slide showing an ESG strategy report that asked a whole bunch of people to say what were their challenges in the coming year. And what's interesting about them, going down them from information security, improved data backup and recovery, increased use of server virtualization, managing data growth, etc., is 3 out of the top 4 they're all to do with backup. Okay, so actually, in terms of issues and challenges, it's a real problem, but it isn't often recognised by senior management in organisations that that's the case. This is quite extraordinary. 15% failure rate when it comes to all backups. Okay, that says 1 in 6 people do their backups, and there's actually a failure associated with it. That's extraordinary when you consider how valuable data has become. 10 to 50% failure rate on restores. So lots of people are sitting there thinking, hey, this is wonderful, I've done my backup, and that's the end of the problem. Okay, don't have to worry about it anymore. But actually the reality is, of course, when you do want to do it, is getting the data back that really counts. Ask that question, why do people do backups? Anyone know? It's the restore, isn't it? Absolutely, that's what people are looking for at the end of the day when there's a disaster happening, when all the heads are, everyone's running around, chaos assumes, and then they realise that actually I need to get that data back. That's the crucial job, and that's why we do backups. It's so that when there's a disaster we can solve the problem very quickly. Look at this one. Nearly a third of companies back data up to tape and do not even test the backup. Sit there in a wonderful little world of saying, I've done my backup, I don't have to worry about it. Didn't bother to check if it was working. What about this one? Nearly 80% of companies who do test their backups found failures. Absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? So in other words, people were saying, I think I've backed up all my data, Everything's wonderful, but when they wanted to restore it, that was a problem. Nearly 2/3 of companies don't have adequate backups for virtualized environments. Virtualization, I'm sure, how many of you, I bet every one of you in fact has probably virtualized their infrastructure somewhere, some part of it. Is that hands, show of hands? Most of you virtualized, I'm sure you have somewhere along the line. But it's interesting, everyone went into it like the sort of lemmings, chasing as everyone did, because hey, this is the next technology, without thinking about what to do when it comes to backup. And then actually in an ideal world, it would have been smarter to fix the backups before actually virtualizing, because that way you would have been sure when you did it all, you wouldn't ever lose any data. Here's just some others. 97%, that's nearly every IT professional feels their data is vulnerable. Half of those are challenged by long backup windows. But actually, give you a couple of anecdotes about backup, in terms of people we've spoken to here, is I've been to see people where, as an example, we were introduced to a health company, and we went in and we spoke to the IT director. And we said, he said, I'm the new IT director. And we said, well, what happened to the old IT director? And he said, well, actually, he's been fired. And we asked, well, why did he get fired? Guess what? He was a guy who loved his tapes. And every week, he put his tapes out in reception to be collected, to take the tapes off site, to be secure. Except one day, the tapes weren't there. They were lost. That company lost its whole database of customers. So you could understand why it was that suddenly having a disk-based and secure solution was going to be interesting. We've been to other organisations in this same sort of set of issues about data and vulnerability, where we had a major company, in fact it's our biggest customer today, who said, hey, we'd like you to look at your tape infrastructure, come and look at our tape infrastructure, see if you can come up with a good solution. And we came up with a good solution. Sadly, they said at the end of it, well actually we looked at the cost and it's going to be pretty expensive to do versus carrying on using our tapes. So we said, okay, that's fine. About 3 months later, they rang us up to say, can you get in here as quick as possible? Guess what had happened? They'd lost a whole database. And the point being, that database was far more expensive loss than it would have been to have actually put in a decent backup solution in the first place. So half of IT is challenged to get more reliable DR. How many of you have got DR in place today and feel sleep at night knowing that nothing can ever affect you? I'll tell you what, even the Japanese, they thought they were safe because they'd even have their data centers in different islands. But it's turned out to be a problem for them. And now, in fact, if you go down to Asia Pac, you'll find nearly all of the companies down there are looking to find disaster recovery sites on other countries. They're looking to the Philippines, they're looking to the Hong Kong, they're looking to Singapore, because that way they can feel that they truly got some kind of disaster recovery. If you look at half of IT is not meeting virtual server backup and recovery goals, so that's coming back to that other one, but it's an issue, right? You can't actually back this stuff up. And half of IT pros say total cost of backup systems is a challenge. So backup systems expensive, and yet it's most valuable data that's being protected. Average of 7 hours to fully recover after a data protection of security. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could sit there, have a problem, fix it within minutes, and never have to admit that you ever had a backup problem in the first place? That's what some of the today's solutions can do. You can now reboot virtual machines from backup data. So there's some amazing things that Graham's going to cover a little bit in some of the more technical side of things. And then lastly, at the end of the day, data center failures cost an awful lot of money. It's very hard, and one of the saddest things of all about backup is it's not easy to justify a return on investment. It's not one of those things you can say that if I spend this amount of money, I'll get this benefit from it. But it ought to be. So, the challenge for IT buyers is that backup looks just like any other storage problem. But it's not. Backup is a data movement. You've got to find some way of getting the data you've got and that's your important, valuable data, and making sure that it's protected. It's also a data processing problem because, of course, the more and more data you have, any of you have experienced this with tape, I'm sure, will know that as more and more data is put in, slower and slower the process becomes. So actually it's about being able to move data fast as well. So it is a data processing problem. And actually deduplication of data, which we're going to talk a little bit more in the technology about, is actually a very complex computing problem in the sense of the way you have to do it, and therefore has an impact. And backup's also a data storage problem as well, because clearly if you back up straight to disk, you keep adding disk, and you keep adding disk, and more disk, the more data that you back up. So what this leads to, simply just saying I can just take some disk and I'll put some deduplication onto my disk, it does lead to a bunch of other problems. So the whole concept of I was talking to you about this sort of straight talk is, before you decide that you're going to go and invest in some kind of backup solution from some perhaps standard primary storage vendor, is ask some of these questions. These are some of the pitfalls which we think you have to think about. So when you go and put this backup solution in, does it actually support everything that you do? Does it support all of the applications that you have? That's number one. Number two, is there missing support for key features of the backup application? So sometimes you go down a route of having a backup application and perhaps you can't take databases directly into the solution, or you can't back up some of your other data. Expanding backup windows as the data grows. One of the problems for most of the backup solutions today is, as the data grows, you end up having to add more and more disk. You have to end up adding disk shelves, that sort of thing. So they really aren't scaling as they should do. Costly forklift upgrades come as a result. How many of you had, I bet there's one or two hands would go up here where you've invested in a solution and found out that 18 months later you're already full and the vendor's telling you actually you need the bigger solution, you need the next one up. It's a classic message from the vendors. And of course they thrive on it because they take more of your money. So one of the things that we think is absolutely vital is that the product has to scale and it has to stop not needing any kind of forklift upgrade. And indeed, I can tell you, I've been with Exagrid for 6 years. We've never obsoleted a product. That must be something in this IT industry, I tell you. Slow restores of traditional fallback or images. So again, when the crisis happens, you want to get that data back as quickly as possible. So what you don't want to have is a solution that actually results in you taking longer, perhaps, than you did with tape. And that can happen with some of the disk-based backup solutions. You don't actually end up getting better off. Slow offsite copy. Whole key idea is that you want to get this data and get it protected as quickly as possible, and you want to offsite it as quickly as possible, because that way you can rest at night. So does your solution, if you're looking at that, allow you to do that? What about incident recovery? Most of the backup applications that are out there today are adding features which make life a lot easier. They're adding functionality. Anything from being able to do an instant VM recovery. Any of you who sat in the room before here probably heard from Veeam, where Veeam, they were talking about Veeam being able to do instant VM recoveries. Or people like Symantec have granular restore technologies. All of these guys are trying to add value in the virtualized world, but actually most of the standard backup solutions don't really work well with those new technologies. And I'll show you why Exagrid is different. High cost for increased equipment over time. One of the things you don't want to do is invest in a solution and find you're locked in, and because you're locked in you have to keep adding more and more money. Classic problem in IT, and it's not very popular with finance directors. Constant extra disk purchases for poor dedupe ratios. So again, the same sort of problem of having, you could have got, sometimes with software dedupe, you only get a very low dedupe ratio. And yet with a hardware platform, you can get very, very high deduplication ratios. That makes a big difference in how much storage you actually need. And lastly, if you get a poor dedupe ratio, pardon me, you'll end up using more bandwidth than you needed to. So these are just some of the considerations, and they are in a book which I'll show you at the very end, which you can look at, which is an independent view, although it's a little bit driven by us, but I hope it'll help you think about things. So I'm going to pass you over to Graham. Graham's now just going to talk about the architecture of the solution that we have, which addresses an awful lot of those pitfalls that which I've just covered. So over to you, Graham.
Thank you.
And I'll be back on for the last 5 minutes, so just tell me a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. So as Andy introduced me, my name's Graham Woods from Exagrid Systems. I'm going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes just explaining what Exagrid has as a technology, but importantly, how we address those pitfalls that Andy mentioned on the previous slide. And then more importantly, why we're different to the other vendors that offer solutions in this space. I will take each of those one by one. Before going into that though, I just want to explain a little bit about the evolution of backup. Over the years, backup has changed. Tape has been around for 60 years as of last year, so 61 years in total. And the fact that tape's been around so long says that there's been very little alternative until quite recently in that scheme. And most recently, there's been a shift from tape to disc. But disc staging has really been used as that first shift away from tape. And what disc staging has offered organizations is the ability to address the challenges of tape. The fact that backup windows can grow as data grows, tape can be unreliable because it's mechanical, restores can take too long if the data is stored in an off-site location, which can be many, many miles away. But the reason that disk originally wasn't widely deployed for backup purposes as a replacement to tape was purely the amount of disk required to keep storing more and more data. As an example, an organization with 10 terabytes of data that wanted 5 copies on disk, without deduplication and without compression utilities, you'd need 50 terabytes of disk just to store 5 copies of that 10 terabytes of data. So disk was used pretty much just to stage the data to disk, get it to disk as quickly as possible, so you solve the backup and restore challenges of that first backup taking place. But then tape was still heavily used to get the data offsite. Until most recently, going back 5 to 8 years ago, when the whole advent of deduplication came into the backup space. And what deduplication within a backup environment allowed is to only store the unique data. So deduplication is an extremely useful technology when it comes to keeping many iterations of data on a single disk unit, because you're only storing the changes that occur between backups. But customers still get the ability to have long-term retention on some spinning media. So Exagrid quite firmly plays in this area. We have a disk-based target that offers deduplication built in, and that's really what we'll focus the rest of the presentation on. Just in terms of a high-level introduction, we make some very bold claims in our marketing material. From an end-user perspective, as each of you are, what we'd expect you to want from your backup solution is the fastest backups. We'd expect you to want the fastest restores, the best scalability, no forklift upgrades, no technology obsolescence, the lowest cost. All of those things tend to be on a tick list, and sometimes there's compromises that need to be made when you look at certain technologies. Exagrid makes some bold claims, as I say. We claim to have the fastest backup performance. We claim to have the fastest restore performance, the best scalability. And I'm going to explain how technically, within our architecture, we achieve each of those things, and that's something I'll come on to explain shortly. So if you look at a fairly typical environment, this pretty much mirrors most customers that we speak to, in that there's a certain number of servers in the environment. Could be email, database, could be file, could be virtualized servers, and traditionally there's a backup application that protects the data to tape, or some people have, as I say, have moved to disk staging already. And this is, as I say, fairly typical, and the reason people would tend to address their backup and data protection needs is to solve those challenges I mentioned earlier about tape, backup window too long, unreliable, restores taking too long. But also, if you look at a traditional backup application and also some of the virtualized backup applications, the vendors have moved their feature sets into technology areas that only really work with disk. So for that reason, people have had to shift away from tape to use the new features within some of the backup applications. So we're presenting a disk-based appliance, installs in well under an hour. Generally, you could install a system in around 30 minutes when it comes to the implementation of the unit, because it's a network-attached storage device. You boot it, you give it some IP addresses, create some shares, and it's ready to receive backup data. You then configure the backup jobs that you already have in existence to target the Exagrid device, and immediately you'll start to see some improvements in terms of backup and restore speeds. We work with a number of different backup applications, traditional ones, such as Symantec, CA, HP with Data Protector as an example. Also, we work with virtualization backup applications, vRanger and Veeam being two examples. And we work with database dumps, SQL dumps, RMAN dumps, and operating system dumps such as tar as an example. But we can work with all of those simultaneously. So to one of Andy's pitfalls a little bit earlier. If you have multiple backup applications and you've chosen the best of breed for the particular data type you want to protect, you can use them all simultaneously if you wanted to with one Exagrid unit, or it gives you the flexibility to move to a new backup application in the future without needing to compromise the storage that you're using. We have a replication capability that I'll explain in more detail a little bit later that allows you to offsite the data electronically. That's incredibly important to customers that want to eliminate tape. And today, almost half of our customers have eliminated tape completely because by the nature of deduplication capabilities built in, you can easily get many months worth of retention on disk. And we have customers with well in excess of 1 year's retention sitting on disk, replicated offsite, therefore no need to use tape. It's only where you start to see many years worth of retention does tape still have a place if there's a second site in existence. So the technology and the environment I've described it as you see it there is not unique. There are other vendors that have this type of technology. There are many primary storage well-known vendors that have that type of technology. So I'm going to move on now to explain why we believe we're different and where our technology is differentiated compared to those others. Now all of those other vendors in the mid-market, the kind of 5 to 80 terabyte type full backup market, we see two approaches to the way in which data could be deduplicated. We take the approach on the right-hand side, post-processing. All of the other vendors in the mid-market take the left-hand option, the inline processing of data. And the one thing I would say is the inline solution does a great job of compressing the data into the smallest possible footprint. But that comes at the cost of performance, because what it's doing is it's doing the deduplication during the backup window, such that when the data is committed to disk, at that point the deduplication has already been performed and completed. And if I draw an analogy, if you had a primary storage subsystem and you just did a backup to it, and you had an inline deduplication appliance from the same vendor and you did a backup to that, generally the deduplication appliance would take longer because all of the processing on the data that's taking place to identify the duplication is performed during that part of the cycle. So what I would say again for organizations, you don't use your backup software to do compression, you use the tape devices to do the compression because of the compute power needed to do that compression, you wouldn't introduce it into the media server. So in our view, deduplication during the backup window is a bottleneck. The best time to perform deduplication is outside of the backup window. As soon as you've done your backups, the devices pretty much sit there and do nothing, waiting for a restore during the working day. That's the point at which when we would deduplicate the data. For that reason, we can quite easily be 2 times or greater faster performing than our competitors. Quite simply, if you look at some environments, we can be much quicker than that, but generally we'll be double the speed of our competitors because we're not incurring that load. It comes at a cost. It requires extra storage to land the data before it's deduplicated, but generally that's not coming at an additional monetary cost. Purely the cost is the additional disk space. The fact we do it that way introduces some extremely useful differentiators when it comes to restoration of data. If you take the inline devices, the second you've finished the backups, you've deduplicated all of the data. And I'll use that 10 terabyte example. If you've just done a 10 terabyte backup, you've just deduplicated 10 terabytes of data and only stored the unique data. You might want to move that data to tape. So now you've got to go through a complete rehydration process to put all the data back together again like a jigsaw puzzle just to get it to tape. Any restores involve rehydration before you can get it back to the primary source. And as people have moved towards virtualization, we've tended to find restores tend to be large amounts of data rather than very small granular amounts of data. So any read-back operation takes time and takes effort within the system when it comes to the inline device. We will not and do not deduplicate the latest set of data. So when you do a recovery from an Exagrid device, you get all of the benefits of disk staging and none of the disadvantages of a deduplication appliance when it comes to recovering from the latest set of data. And most often it's the most recent version of data that's required because of a file deletion or corruption or something of that nature. So the fact we have that stored not only helps for tape copies and for general restores, it also helps for those backup applications I just mentioned that are starting to use disk more cleverly when it comes to restoration of data. And I'll use one of the partners that are here today. Veeam is a perfect example. Veeam has a facility whereby you can back up a virtual machine at the VMDK level or at the image level, so you get the benefits of just backing up a large chunk of data. but you can still pull out single files as an example, rather than having to recover the virtual machine booted to get files out. So in that situation, having our landing zone storing that data makes that restore process much quicker. But also they have a feature called instant VM recovery and another one called sure backup, which allows you to, as an example, boot a virtual machine directly from the backup storage. If you boot a virtual machine from a deduplicated version of it, it generally takes much longer than it would to restore it, because it's a very random access process, and on the fly you have to go through the rehydration. With an Exagrid device, we've got that data stored. We can boot a virtual machine in seconds, in most cases minutes. And one thing to illustrate that, the Enterprise Strategy Group recently did a laboratory test of us with Veeam, and they had a 2 terabyte virtual machine, and that machine, from starting the recovery process to that machine being back in production, took 3 minutes. Those are the sorts of restore times unheard of in the past when it comes to recovering data from a backup target. And generally from this type of device, I've seen it take many hours. And that's something that customers will see, analysts have reported. So we're given the best of both worlds, all the benefits of disk staging and all the benefits of deduplication within it. But also key to any solution is the ability for that solution to scale with the environment. And that's one thing that's kind of got forgotten about in a data protection environment over the years, because what tends to happen is a solution starts with a deduplication engine. That fixes the performance because that's got the processing power within it that does deduplication and rehydration. And then to expand the system, take the approach that you put disk shelves in. It's an approach that's been there for many, many years. The challenge with that approach is that for every extra terabyte of data that you back up, and generally you add disk because you've got more data, the more data you have, the longer it takes to deduplicate it, because at no point have you changed the processing power. The one thing I would say, though, is you could have the processing power needed for the backup window you expect in 3 years' time. But then you overbuy because the cost of processing comes down and down and down. It has for many years. The other challenge with this approach is whilst you can install disk onto the controller, you can't put an infinite amount of disk in place. No primary storage controller or even backup storage controller can have an infinite amount of disk put in that can go to many, many terabytes, in some cases many petabytes. So you get to a point where you can put so much disk in, but once you've fully loaded that controller, the only option is the bigger, faster controller that supports more disk, or separate controllers which then decentralize the backup storage. And as I say, that's not an approach that we wanted to adopt. It's certainly not an approach that we did adopt. We've adopted a grid technology when it comes to scaling our system. So our system scales with deduplication engines. Every time you add the capacity to the system, importantly you're adding compute power to deduplicate the data, bandwidth to allow you to get the data in, and of course memory and compute power to get the restoration of data performed. So taking this example, we could go from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 to 60 terabytes of Exagrid storage. We can ingest, deduplicate, recover and tape copy 60 terabytes in the same time that we can do 10. The maximum capacity machine we have is 13 terabytes in a single system, and the maximum size of our grid is 10 machines. So we can go to 130 terabytes of backup data in a single full backup ingested in one single unit, but you can mix and match different machines into the grid. So a 20 terabyte grid, as an example, could be 4 of our 5 terabyte machines, a 13 and a 7, 4 5s, 5 4s. You can mix it as you need to that maximum of 10, so it's very flexible in the way it scales. So if an organization is budget constrained and just wants to fix the backups for a small amount of critical data, it can still grow in the future without being compromised in terms of the scalability that you see on the left-hand slide there. The other useful feature of our grid technology is we can put different generations of system in the same grid. So an organization that had bought a machine 5 years ago can introduce a new machine into that grid that wasn't even on the roadmap 5 years ago. So it protects the investment that they've made moving forward. So as I say, it gives a very differentiated approach to the way in which the system scales. Also allows you to grow when you need to grow and protect that investment, as I say. And this is a common feature that I see across our kind of landscape today, if you look at the data protection landscape, is it's easy for a vendor to try and make you do forklift upgrades as data grows. It's easy for a vendor to introduce a new system every 18 months and go from, as an example, a 400 series to a 500 series to a 600 series with no compatibility between them. That's absolutely not what Exagrid does with their technology. We have a technology that grows with the capacities that you need, but keeps your backup window the same. Generally, if you were to go and buy a new solution tomorrow, it would be to fix a backup or restore problem. Those problems we address within the box as it is today. We also have the ability to protect data to an off-site location. It works at the byte level, so we only replicate the bytes that change between backups. It allows it to be very efficient, therefore, in terms of the bandwidth required. To give you an example of what that means, I'm using a 10 terabyte full backup as the example. And the numbers that you're going to see on this slide are taking the average change in compression ratios from across our customer base, which consists of over 6,000 machines. So it's a very reasonable number to be putting on the screen. So first time we see a 10 terabyte backup, we compress it and we ship it to the remote site. That could be done with both machines together and then split apart, or it could be done over the wire depending on the bandwidth between sites. But from that point forward, we only replicate the bytes that change between backups. So using that average change ratio we see across our customer base, we'd only expect to replicate about 200 gigabytes of data as a result of there being a 10 terabyte full backup. In terms of bandwidth requirement, that means you need approximately 3 megabits of bandwidth for every 1 terabyte of backup data. It's very rare to find a customer that can't implement the bandwidth required in a cost-effective manner to get that data replicated off-site. We also, on the remote site, update that compressed version to store the most recent version of data. So if you were, as an example, using Symantec and there was knowledge of the catalogs on the remote site, you could do a tape copy remotely without needing to rehydrate, just uncompress to get that data to tape. And that's how the process continues. We land the data, compare, compress, replicate the changes and store them. Very straightforward and a very easy way to get the challenges that you see of tape eliminated from an environment. Maximum topology we support today is 8 remote sites into one. No software license costs at all, so 2 units by default you can replicate between them. There is no additional software licensing incurred as far as Exagrid is concerned. So what we're trying to do really is take backup to a point where you can literally just set the jobs and forget about them, because the mechanical nature of backup disappears with a technology such as this. In terms of the type of organization we can work with, pretty much anybody that has any of the backup applications listed on this slide. And this is something we're constantly updating. For any of you that saw the presentation earlier this year, this list has been expanded since, and it will continue to expand over time, covering traditional backup apps, specific application backup apps, and operating system backup applications. But also one thing I didn't mention earlier but should mention at this point is that some of these backup applications have deduplication built into the software. Some organizations might want to use that for a number of reasons. Sometimes it affects performance, but sometimes people will use the inbuilt backup application's deduplication. If I take Commvault as an example, and also Veeam as another example, and also CA as an example, you could switch on deduplication within those applications, and we would be able to further deduplicate that data due to the nature of our byte level algorithm versus the block size algorithm that those other vendors are taking. So we can add value over and above a standard backup application with deduplication switched on. And we can add anything from 3 to 1 upwards of deduplication. I see a question.
I have a question. I don't see Microsoft on this.
When you say Microsoft, do you mean DPM? Or do you mean Microsoft in general? So if anybody has a Microsoft operating system, whether it's Windows Server, storage server, they would have a traditional backup application that would sit in the Microsoft operating system to protect the data within it. So they'd have Exchange agents, SQL agents. So we work with any with any operating system that these guys can sit on, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's AIX, any Linux flavor. So operating systems are something in many cases we're agnostic from. And as I say, we can further deduplicate deduplicated data. Very easy to manage, very easy to control. As I say, it adds the set and forget nature into a backup environment. Happy to take any other questions at this point before I hand you back to Andy, just to close off the presentation. Does anybody have any questions for me I can help with before I hand you over? Perfect.
Okay.
5 plus that one. There you go.
So just going to finish off with a quick commercial break, if you like, 2-3 minutes on who Exagrid really are, Exagrid's a US-based company on the east coast of America. Anyone been to Boston? We're about 15 miles outside of Boston. One of the fastest growing companies on the east coast of America, and we're privately held as a company. So, you know, against all those big storage vendors who are brand name companies, we're relatively small. But we are planning to go public in the next 18 months to 2 years, when we'll be running around about $100 million business. So we are growing pretty rapidly. The product, as we've already talked about, very scalable performance when it comes to both restore and backup. We tend to say it that way round, and we really do focus on having the best product at the best price. So, you know, go and ask Atea, ask your sales reps to get you quotes for solutions and see how they stack up against some of the other things that you've tried to do. Over 6,000 systems, Graham mentioned, something like nearly 2,500 to 3,000 customers on a worldwide basis, so we've got a good installed base. About 50% of our customers have a replication situation, so they have both sites. They have a home site and the DR site, so they get rid of tape altogether. The other thing that's worth pointing out here is the customer success stories. There's over 340, I think it is now, customer success stories. And it's our way of getting the message out there that, yeah, we're relatively small, we're not a brand name, but boy, if you look at that list of customer success stories, you'll see lots of named individuals, named companies talking about what a difference we made to their business. And that's the way of getting over the message, because some of the big bullying companies can go and tell people that, oh, Exagrid's going out of business, or Exagrid product doesn't work, don't consider it, just stick with us. And the reality is, you'll see we do make a difference, the product does just work. So it's our kind of way of having a brand. Graham's already talked here a little bit about the backup applications. More important thing is customers, of course. I've just talked there about the customer success stories. Interesting question I often get asked is, which markets really go more for backup, disk-based backup than others? And one of the questions I might ask you is, anyone know how long tape's been around? Anyone guess? I should give the prize for this one now if they get close.
Tell them about 10 minutes ago.
It's actually 61 years. It's still there. See, right. But so with that, tape's been around an awful long time, and of course, tape's everywhere where computers are. So computers are everywhere. So it doesn't matter whether it's manufacturing, whether it's healthcare, banking, insurance, business services, and government. And what we find in individual markets is really down to where the money is. Okay, because backup's one of those things that's always sort of down the bottom end of the list. Your IT boss says, well, can't you fix it another way? Can't you bandage it up for another 3 months? What we tend to find is actually in the UK, for instance, banking, insurance and law is one of the hotspots at the moment where people are investing heavily in disk-based backup. We also find that in some countries like Singapore, it's all government controlled. So there's lots of different things happening. One of the nicest things of all, I think, is that when you get accolades from the industry, from the analysts, and you'll find on our website, you'll also find literature on our stand, that most recently we've had 2 very good analysts say that Exagrid has the best product, effectively. So there's an Infotech survey, which is, I think, on here, Infotech, and also there's a latest DCIG. And there's some detail about that in our package of literature. But just as an example, this is the Infotech one. Basically, here's the message. Sorry, here. Okay, that Exagrid's a champion. That's how they see us. Okay. On the DCIG report, oh, it's not gone. You took it. No. On the DCIG report, what you'll find is there's actually a less than 50k market and the 50k to 100k market, and they looked at all the products and they looked at everything about the products. They looked at everything from everyone's website and everything else. And Exagrid took 6 or 7 of the top 10 spots in each of those 2 markets. So we know we've got a great product, and the only thing we can do is get the message out to people like yourselves that please go try. You'd be amazed what a different product we have versus anything else you've used today. So I think on the last quick summary here, I indicated earlier on, there are some books around. They're part of a series of books which are trying to help people like yourselves make some good decisions. And if you haven't completed one of these things, please do so. And we'll be doing the draw, I think, around about 5 o'clock at the end of the show outside. So any questions? That's it from me. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll let you go and have yet another cup of coffee.